Timeline Iran returns with a gripping account of the Iranian Revolution. William Daugherty, a young CIA operative stationed in Tehran, found himself at the epicenter of history when the U.S. Embassy was seized in 1979. His story is one of captivity, resilience, and a unique vantage point on a tumultuous era. In this exclusive interview, Daugherty sheds light on the intelligence failures that blinded the U.S. government to the escalating crisis. He reveals the deep chasm between Washington's assumptions and the volatile reality of Iran. We'll explore how the Shah's secret illness, unknown to American officials, became a pivotal factor in the revolution's trajectory. Daugherty shares insights into the controversial decision to admit the Shah to the U.S. for medical treatment, a move that triggered the 444-day hostage crisis. Join us for an in-depth examination of the events that led to the severing of U.S. Iran relations. This is a story of political misjudgments, unforeseen consequences, and the enduring impact of a conflict that continues to resonate today. Talk to us about arriving in Iran September 12th, 1979, as a young man. What was your role? What was your expectations of Iran and the new country you're going to?
I knew very little about Iran, actually. I had no expectations other than trying to do my job. As a new officer in the organization, I knew there was a certain element of danger. There had been American officials assassinated in Iran, a couple of years before for various reasons. The embassy had been taken over in what we call the St. Valentine's Day open house on the 14th of February. But it looked like the situation was improving some, but a misstep would have, perhaps created a very serious situation. So what I really wanted to do was just do the job that I was trained for and do it without serious mistakes, and hopefully provide some information, some intelligence back to Washington that would have been useful, because there was none, really. The powers in Washington, the White House, the State Department, the CIA, the problem was we did not know what was happening in Iran. We did not know who the policymakers were. We did not know who was in charge. It was very chaotic. Whatever decisions the provisional secular government could make or were making could be overturned by almost anyone close to Khomeini, and then overturned by somebody else who felt differently. And Khomeini himself could change his mind based on the last person. That the United States government needed to know really who was in charge, who was making the decisions in what areas, because we had a lot of issues to resolve with the Iranian government. So there was a very full plate to work on. We needed sources. Most of the intelligence sources that we'd had fled the country wisely after they'd taken the embassy back in February. And with the arrival of Khomeini and then the trials where folks close to the Shah were being executed nightly, we needed to identify folks who would agree to work with the CIA in a clandestine manner and provide us with information we needed. And so that was really my focus.
How much do we know about the Shah's illness?
None. I've seen where eventually the French government had found out about it, but I don't know that for sure. I think that if the French government had found out, that eventually we, the U.S. government, in one way or another, overtly or otherwise, would have found out as well. But ultimately, the fact remains is that the United States government really had no idea that the Shah was ill.
So not knowing that he's sick, we didn't really foresee the Shah's falling from power.
No, the plan, which it was to me rather silly even at the time, was that the United States government expected the Shah to last another 15 to 20 years. Zbigniew Brzezinski writes about this. Several of the others do too, and that was the expectation in the Department of State, was that we did not need to make major changes or look for major changes in Iran, because the Shah was going to be in power for at least until the 1990s and maybe close to 2000. So the U.S. policy basically was keep hands off. Things were going very well. We didn't need to know really anything else about the Iranian government, just to maintain contact with the Shah. And in the Nixon administration, it was to basically give the Shah anything he wanted except nuclear weapons, and to enable him to serve as sort of the policeman of the Middle East and a statesman-like role. And things were going to be fine.
You're correct, we were planning on the Shah being there. But I'm seeing the declassified memos from the times that we were always reconsidering and looking at various options should the Shah not be in power. Please talk to us about those options, particularly the Queen, the Prince, the National Front, the military, and the Islamists. Those were the options. At the time of the revolution, you mentioned you were talking to the oppositions. What were our thoughts? What was U.S. policy on all these different factors vying for power? What was our take on that at the time?
Well, the policy that really counts was what was at the White House. Their belief very strongly was that despite the growing revolution, was that the Shah was going to handle everything. There were folks at the CIA and the State Department that thought that at some point perhaps the Shah should transition to being a constitutional monarch, and the United States would perhaps look to the leaders of the National Front to form a democratic government. The leaders of the National Front were aging fairly quickly, and I don't know whether, even at the time, how viable that was to be bringing in 60 and 70-year-old men in a population that was very young. I don't think they put a lot of stock in the Islamist movement at the time. Everybody was very happy with the Shah moving as he did in a secular direction. The United States government wanted to see more of that. They applauded the Shah for his secular policies. I think the evidence is strong in the direction of just maintaining hands off with the Shah, in that the revolution was very well along before there was a high-level meeting held among the principals and the deputies at the White House to discuss the revolution. And it was the first, these very high-level secretaries and deputy secretaries within the national security community in the Carter administration to do this. And the administration was basically 2.5 years old, and they had never convened a high-level meeting at the White House to discuss the future of Iran, nor had they convened such a meeting after the revolution began to discuss potential outcomes of the revolution. They simply believed that the Shah was going to take care of everything as he had in the past, and so they proceeded to look at other things. And there were other things going on. There were two major projects that the White House was moving on. One was a strategic arms limitation treaty with the Soviet Union, and second, which had very much the attention of President Carter, were Camp David talks between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I think it was easy for them to basically say, we know the Shah is going to take care of everything in Iran, so we're going to go over here and try to resolve these serious issues, and we really don't need to worry about Iran. When a new presidential administration comes into power, usually, they review all of the major policies of the previous administration, not with an idea to willy-nilly overturn them, as we've recently seen. Presidents, and particularly of different parties, have different policy goals and objectives. So they want to see if they can fit in their own objectives and goals, or whether they're perhaps being met, or perhaps they need to be modified. That was not done, as I said, with Iran in the Carter administration. They had no review of Iran until 2.5 years into their term, and the revolution was already well in progress.
Let's talk about President Carter's administration. I know a lot of Iranian Americans are very tough on President Carter. They blame him for the Shah falling and for bringing Khomeini to power. I kind of had that feeling at the beginning, but after doing all this research, I have more empathy for the man and the decisions and what he was facing. I've seen your interviews, and as a former hostage and what you went through, you still have empathy for him, and you understand the decisions that he had in scenarios that he had in front of him, and the limited decisions that he was able to make. Can you talk about him and the factors, his idealism, his wanting of human rights for Iran, and how that played into this whole thing? And even at the end with Khomeini, he said we thought it was going to go to Qom and he's going to be the spiritual leader and it was going to be a happy ending. But apparently nobody read Khomeini's book that he had written or listened to any of his tapes, his sermons that he was giving. Please talk about that.
Okay.
I know there's a lot in there, but I just kind of left you with it.
I'll just sort of mumble along here. First, it's a myth that the president has control of everything that happens overseas. We don't. The U.S. government, the U.S. government does not, and certainly the president does not. Foreign leaders have an independent will, and they have their own policy objectives, their own policy goals, and they have their own domestic political constituencies, whether it's the people in a democracy or cabal in a junta or the henchmen in a dictatorship. So things happen overseas that the president may get the blame for, but which he never wanted and never sought and perhaps tried to prevent in various ways. So to saddle President Carter with the blame for the fall of the Shah certainly I think is a major step in the wrong direction. Part of the blame for the Shah's problems lies with the Shah, certainly, and a large segment of that is the fact that he didn't tell anybody that he was sick. Had he done so, he could have managed his illness probably. That seems to be the consensus of most of the doctors, that what he had was certainly treatable and he could have lived a long, productive life. He was worried about being seen as weak. I think you can make an argument that by hiding it, when it finally did come out into the open, he seemed a lot weaker than he would have. So that's a large part of his downfall, was his own actions. Another part of that was when the revolution started, he couldn't make up his mind on whether to crack down or whether to let it go. And if he was going to not crack down, how was he going to deal with the opponents of the regime? Was he going to ignore them? Was he going to try to come to accommodation with them? Was he going to expect the United States to come in and do something? Clearly, I think he wanted the United States to tell him what to do. And maybe if Richard Nixon had been president, he might have gotten explicit direction. He wasn't going to get explicit direction under Jimmy Carter. And that's not a criticism of Carter. He was the Shah. He was the leader of his country. He had a domestic problem. He could come to the United States perhaps, for some advice, but the advice that he was getting through his ambassador to the United States was mixed as well. The State Department was saying things like, think about a constitutional monarchy and appointing a Democratic prime minister and having elections. And from Brzezinski and from the Defense Department, it was more towards cracking down on the revolutions. He was stumbling around, didn't know what to do, dealing with this illness that was obviously weighing very heavily on him. He'd gone through it for 6 years. He had not had the treatment that he should have had for that illness, which was what was really making him weaker, mentally and emotionally, psychologically, as well as physically. I think the ultimate denouement of the whole thing lies at really at the feet of the Shah. And it did not make it any easier for the American government to figure out what to do to help the Shah, because we couldn't figure out really what the Shah himself wanted to do. And I think Carter was right. It wasn't up to us to tell the Shah. One senior CIA officer who had a lot of experience in Iran, who has never been named in any of the books in case people want to try to identify him. He's never been identified publicly, which is fine, and I'm not going to do it now. Several of us were sitting in the office of the director of Iranian matters that day, the head of the Iran desk at the agency, and it was a few weeks before I was leaving. And basically, and I'll clean this up, but basically he said the history of Iran is that, one strong dictator has always replaced another. And he said that's what's going to happen with Khomeini. All this talk about Khomeini being a constitutional monarch and retiring to Qom, there he was in Paris talking about being or instituting an Islamic regime, and it seemed very clear that that's what he wanted to do. There was no reason not to believe him. So this officer's thinking was that anybody that thought Khomeini was going to fly back into Tehran, set up a government, and then retire quietly to Qom was engaging in self-delusion. And of course, that's exactly what happened. Khomeini just became a dictator that replaced another dictator who had replaced a dictator, and so on. So there were some folks who weren't deluded, but the CIA is not a policy-making organization, of course.
Let's get to the takeover of the embassy. Let's talk a little bit about that and the wider ramifications it had with the whole relations between Iran and the U.S. Talk to us about the February 14th takeover. You mentioned that the open house, Valentine's Day open house.
Yeah, that was basically just a bunch of thugs that came.
Yeah. It was a short episode and it was taken care of. But how did that change the thinking in the U.S. and the administration about what was going on in Iran on admitting the Shah and what consequences it would have for relations and for you all in the embassy?
My assessment is that it had very little. What they did was send security experts over to figure out how better to fortify the embassy. They did such a great job that it took the Iranians only 45 minutes to break into the embassy. It was protected from gunfire. The embassy, both floors had very, very tall windows. And so for the bottom half of the windows, they put strong metal plates on both sides and then filled it with sand, which would have stopped small arms. I don't think it would have stopped 12.5 millimeter rapid fire weapons and larger. But it would have stopped 7.62 and those sorts of things. They strengthened the door to the second floor of the embassy with the idea that if the attackers ever got inside the embassy, the staff would go to the second floor and bar the door, and that door would be strong enough to keep the invaders out for a couple hours until help would come. And there was always this assumption, which I never believed, was that, of course, help was always going to come. And then they proceeded to do business as usual. After the 14th, the embassy drew down for a while. And then around June, as things stabilized, the embassy started to build back up in staff. That was one of the things that the Iranians who eventually took the embassy and others misread. They thought everybody that was coming back into the embassy was CIA. And in fact, there was one CIA officer over the extended weeks that was replaced every 2 or 3 weeks, and that officer really could do nothing. The people that were coming back in were State Department and military. And the military was important because we had about $6 billion worth of military goods that we had sold to Iran or were in the process of selling to Iran we had delivered much of that material, as you know, but then had not delivered the money once the revolution started. The military, particularly the Military Assistance Advisory Group, was there to start working with the Iranians, whatever the Iranian government turned out to be, to resolve this, because the Iranians wanted either the money or the weaponry, preferably the weaponry. The United States government wasn't sure what we were going to do. And I was personally involved in that in my cover job as political military affairs officer. So in the time that I was there, I sat in a number of meetings where this was discussed.
Was that part of General Piser's mission to Iran as well?
No. Lieutenant General Phil Gast was the head of the military advisory group. General Heiser was sent later on to try to basically convince the Shah to institute martial law and to send out the military to put a stop to the rebellion one way or another. General Heiser was, I believe he was the second in command in the American forces in Europe. And he had previous service in Iran. He knew a lot of the senior Iranian generals. Towards the end of the Shah's regime, the general was sent over there to basically build a fire under the Shah and tell him that he needed to institute martial law and to release the military on the revolutionaries to put it down. Otherwise, he was going to lose his country. And by that time, the Shah just couldn't do it. General Phil Gast was head of the military advisory group, and that was part of what they were doing. And I attended a number of missions or meetings with General Gast, where it was very difficult dealing with the Iranians. They were very sure of what they wanted, and the United States was very much at a disadvantage. I think the main thing that we could do at that time was just to report back to Washington on the Iranian position and let the policymakers start to deal with it back home.
Let's get back to the decision of President Carter to let the Shah in. There was the Valentine's Day takeover, and we heard there was a couple of other instances of attacks on the embassy, correct? There was no other thing?
Not that I know of.
No, just the one time.
I have never heard of any other
I heard that from
attack.
Other people, but you would probably be best to know.
Well, it may depend on what somebody's definition of an attack is.
They didn't breach the walls?
If 5 people throw rocks over the wall at the embassy, is that an attack? I mean, stuff like that happened from time to time, but what we would determine would constitute an attack never happened. There were always these huge demonstrations in front of the embassy, but they never breached the walls. Other than being very loud and very long, they really didn't even cause any damage.
President Carter allowed the Shah to come in. We've heard that President Carter allowed the Shah to come into the U.S. He knew, he had heard the warnings of what would happen to the embassy staff. But we'd heard that he had gotten assurances from people in Iran that this would be solved in a way, the de-escalation of the situation once it did happen. Can you tell us about that, about if there were any assurances? And can we talk about Chargé d'Affaires, Mr. Langen's memo and what that contained? And can you talk a little bit about that?
And I've had the opportunity to talk to Hamilton Jordan about it and several others, Dr. Brzezinski, others in the State Department. And I asked him, where did this concept, this idea that the Iranians had guaranteed or promised or assured the safety of the embassy? Because they never had. And this was a topic within the embassy. Chargé d'Affaires Bruce Langdon, in his cables, periodic cables throughout the summer back to Washington, where he said, if you let the Shah in, they're going to come and take the embassy, and the Iranian government is not going to be able to probably protect this. It was clear in his cables. And then when the director of Iranian affairs at the State Department and Chargé d'Affaires Langdon went down to the foreign ministry to advise them that the Shah was coming into the United States, they said this is a bad idea because if they come to the embassy, we cannot protect you. This is a terrible thing. And that was put in a cable that was by Bruce Langdon that was sent back to Washington. And I asked Hamilton Jordan about it, and he said by that time, cables from Tehran didn't matter.
The hostage crisis was a reason for breaking relations between the Iran and U.S. You had mentioned before that you don't think that would have been the only reason. If it wasn't for the hostage crisis, the Islamic Republic in Iran, they would have found another reason to break off relations. Talk about that a little bit. Do you really believe that? I mean, they were just looking for an excuse and this was one excuse?
That was kind of the general belief. The way the revolution had gone, kind of the conventional wisdom in the halls at Langley anyway, were that it would be hard to deal with a government with the Islamic regime, both on a philosophical and political level, not to mention the nuts and bolts of working out financial issues and the military sales and the American corporations that had pulled out and the Iranian monies that were in Western banks. The general consensus basically was that this new regime, whatever it was going to turn out to be, probably was not going to want to work with the American government, at least for a while. And given the hostility that they had towards the American government by that point, more than likely they would have found some reason. There just didn't seem to be, on the part of the Iranians, a desire to have any type of relationship with Americans. And indeed, a lot of Iranians had thought that the United States would break relations after the February 14th event. And a large percentage of the large number that were aware of it and focused on it and whatever, actually were disappointed that the relationship continued. They were disappointed in their own government for not breaking relations with the U.S., and they were angry at the U.S. for not breaking relations on our part. That was another piece, I think, of conventional wisdom, and I agreed with it. I think that's probably right.
Regardless of the political and economic atmosphere, one of the main reasons for President Carter allowing the Shah into the U.S. was humanitarian. And as you saw in our documentary, that decision was based on the report given by Dr. Keene to Dr. Ibn Dusset, the State Department medical representative in Washington, saying that the Shah's situation, his illness, whether it could be cured, taken care of in Mexico or New York. And from what we heard, Dr. Dustin was very aware of the Shah situation. But somewhere in there, the message given to the president was that the Shah was not going to be able to survive in Mexico. He was going to die. It was going to be on his shoulders, and that was a factor. Where did that alteration of the message come from? Where did it get changed a little bit?
That's why I came all the way out here from Georgia, hoping to find out at least part of that. At the end of your movie, one of the interlocutors says that the problem is that the Shah just needed medical care, straight medical care, but it was mixed in with all this political stuff, and his medical care was determined not by what he needed, but by the politics. I hadn't thought of that before. I hadn't been really aware of, for example, the pressure that was put on by his sister Ashraf and the Queen. It appears, at least for now, that the word came back from Mexico that the Shah was not in a life-threatening situation and that he could be treated in Mexico City. On the American side, that information was very close hold. I'm not sure all who would have seen it, but I suspect it was so close hold that probably Dr. Dustin would have told, obviously, the Secretary of State, Cy Vance, the Undersecretary of State, Dave Newsom. They would have told, for sure, they would have told National Security Advisor Brzezinski. I've never heard that they told the CIA Director, Admiral Turner. And if not, then that would certainly tell you how close hold that information was. But when Brzezinski told Carter at Camp David after Carter had come back from the Kennedy Library, it was the Shah is the Shah, his life is, death is imminent, basically. And the only place he can be treated is at this one hospital in New York. And on its face, any reasonable person who has any awareness of foreign countries and the world in general, and of the United States itself, should know that there are other hospitals that are just as competent as New York Presbyterian and Sloan Kettering. Why, for example, was not MD Anderson considered? There's a strain of thought that says MD Anderson is a better hospital for many types of cancer than Sloan Kettering. It wasn't such a bizarre, weird type of cancer that it probably could have been treated at Cleveland Clinic or many other hospitals here in the U.S. And if it could be treated at other hospitals here in the U.S., what about South Africa? They did the first heart transplant down there. England, France, certainly there were other hospitals. In fact, the Shah had been invited to go to South Africa when he left Iran. And throughout his whole ordeal, his world voyage, the South Africans multiple times asked him to come to South Africa. And he wouldn't do it because his father had died in South Africa. And he didn't want to die in the same country that his father had. Think of how different the world would be if he had done that. But he could have gone down there, he could have gotten the treatment that he needed without all this extraneous and totally unnecessary and very harmful political mess that surrounded it all. But it was there, and somehow, between these 4 or 5 people, and I don't think it was Secretary Vance, Undersecretary Newsom, I don't think it was Brzezinski that changed it. I think the pressure had to come from the Shah's immediate family. By the time it got to Brzezinski, it had changed. And there's only 2 or 3 people that could have done it.
Hope we figure out someday that. That's a
I
very
hope we do.
issue.
And Dr. Dustin has never said a word about it.
Dr. Cervantes was actually in the room with him, and he says he told him, I can do the surgery. He would have been the surgeon. He said, I can do it. I've done it many times. It's very, but so Dr. Dustin definitely knew of the capability of that doctor to do the surgery.
And our Mayo has never said anything.
I requested to talk to him. I actually went to New York, and the last minute he canceled on me. He said he has a confidentiality clause with the Shah that he can't discuss it. I'm still hoping to talk to him at some time. Let's just change about this, the Iran, and look at the bigger picture. Let's talk about the Soviets' role. At the time of the revolution, we had 50,000, 60,000 people in Iran. We had a strong military presence. We had very close relations with the government that we had very close ties with. And the Soviets had very little influence there. Looking back to 2017, we have very little influence in Iran. The Russians, I've been there, they have a lot of influence there, militarily, economically, politically. And a lot of people say that the Soviets were involved in the revolution. They had a hand in it from the beginning. They influenced things, and now you look at it in hindsight, you see that they're in a better position than us. Were we outmatched in Iran?
We never found any evidence of Soviet influence. The Shah was rather disdainful of the Soviets, actually. In fact, just a couple of years before, his counterintelligence folks had discovered a very, very senior general and longtime friend of the Shah had been passing military secrets to the Soviets. And this general was very quickly executed, which brought something of a downturn in Soviet-Iranian relations, and it may not have quite recovered by the time of the embassy takeover. The Iranians, in fact, the revolutionaries at some point had actually, then tried to attack the Russian embassy, the Soviet embassy. However, very quickly, the Iranian authorities got them away from it. But we've never seen any evidence that the Soviets had any influence. Did they benefit from it? Eventually. It took some years, I think. One of the things that opened the door was the Gulf War in 1991, because the Iraqis flew most of their Soviet-made aircraft over to Iran. When the war was over, Saddam asked for the airplanes back, and the Iranians said, what airplanes? But they were in very bad shape. The Iranian government asked the Soviets to send their experts down and maintain and repair the MiGs and the Sukhois that the Iraqis had conveniently deposited on Iranian soil, and so now they're part of the Iranian military. That opened the door. The Soviets took advantage of it, as they usually do. And now, of course, with Iran and the Iraqi government being so close, and Hezbollah being so strong, the Iranians now have a great deal of power and authority in that region of the Middle East, which is what, of course, the Israelis told President George W. Bush in 2002 and 2003. They said, if you invade Iraq, all you're going to do is make Iran the most powerful. And they said, you don't need to take care of the Iraqi military. We, the Israelis, can do that. But if you go in and do that, then Iran is going to be the powerhouse of the Middle East. And they laid out the reasons why, and it's certainly come to pass. And now the U.S. is running into danger over there now, because as the territory for ISIS shrinks, when it was larger, the Soviets or the Russians were attacking certain parts of ISIS, and the United States aircraft were attacking certain parts of ISIS. And deconfliction was an issue, but not a big issue. But as that ISIS territory has shrunk, deconfliction has become far more important. And yet it's been difficult dealing with the Soviets because the Soviets are protecting Syria just as Iran is. And when I talk about Iran now being allied mostly with Iraq and having grown Hezbollah, you can throw Syria into the mix as a protege of the Iranian government as well. So that's a huge territory, and the Russians have had and still have their own interests in Syria and in Lebanon and Iraq. So it may have taken 30 years or so, but the Soviets have certainly over time benefited from the loss of American influence in Iran.
Are there people in position of power that really believe that we can cause a rift between Shia clergy as opposed to hardliner and moderate? Is that a belief in Washington?
Today, I don't know, but back in 2001, and it may have started. It may have started towards the end of the Clinton years. As you recall, Clinton and Secretary of State Madeleine Albright had more or less apologized to Iran for the 1953 coup. But by 2001, Iranians and Americans were meeting secretly in Switzerland, in Geneva. And not just sitting at the table staring at each other, but they were engaging in discussions, and they were it was little things, but they were building trust. I know the American side was hopeful, not unduly so. And they certainly believed that the Iranian delegation was operating with the authority of the Iranian government because they were wanting to move ahead, but very slowly. Again, it was more building trust at that point than anything else, than any agreements or whatever. And then in 2002, at the State of the Union, President Bush gives his axis of evil speech, and the speechwriter throws in Iran as part of that axis, which was one of the stupidest things that probably has happened in the 21st century in American government. All I can figure is that the speechwriter has acknowledged that he wanted to bolster, President Bush because his argument for invading Iraq was very weak, and fortunately, they couldn't convince the American people that it was weak, and so we made that huge mistake. As soon as he made the axis of evil speech and threw Iran in with it, the Iranian delegation in Geneva got up and left, and didn't come back. And so whatever hope there was at that point just shattered. Obama came in and I think genuinely wanted to better relations. Every American president's wanted to better relations, but with the election of Rouhani, that's the best chance we've had. The Green Revolution presented Obama with a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. There was a lot of pressure to provide help covertly to the Green movement, but to do so would have left the United States open to charges of another 1953. We're doing this to overthrow the Iranian regime. And that's certainly one way to have interpreted any help that we would have given them. On the other hand, he was criticized for not doing anything other than, a few occasional words of support and encouragement. But I think there was a lot of hope that the Green movement would succeed here in the States. And certainly in the U.S. government, and I think there is still hope. My understanding is that the majority of the Iranian people want relations with the West. I understand that somewhere around 75 to 80% of the Iranians were born after the revolution. They, however, do understand that everything that Khomeini promised has not come to fruition. That they've been, their country's been pariahs for 30 years or more. I do know that many of the Iranian people know what they're missing because of that. In Tehran and the larger cities, when the sun goes down at night, the satellite dishes go up, although they're illegal. the sun comes up in the morning, the satellite dishes go down. So they not only get Arabsat and the European channels, they get American TV as well. I understand years ago when I was in the agency that Baywatch was a real favorite.
Streets were empty when the Baywatch would come on.
It was probably more popular over there than over here. And the university has been open. The Iranian people are very, very well educated. The main problem is getting past all the bitterness and the suspicion. And the Iranians will throw out, why don't you Americans get over 1979? And the Americans will say, well, why don't you guys get over 1953? And until those kinds of emotional things can be just set aside, and you get folks that look to the future. So it's probably going to take some more time, but there's always hope that it's going to happen.
Having said what you just said, next time there is some kind of a movement in Iran, a democratic or a secular movement, how can we support them without the obvious fact that our support could hinder them as being a tool of the U.S. or a machination of the U.S.? How can we support movements there if our involvement would bring them down? That's the policy that President Obama said. If we help them, it looks like we're helping them and they'll fall. Well, they fell anyway. What can we do?
I think the first thing would be find some way to keep the American government totally out of it, even covertly. Maybe develop spontaneously or nearly spontaneous Iranian American groups on university campuses and in other areas where there could be demonstrations of just people, not the U.S. government spouting policy positions, but just American people saying it's time, and university students, I think, would probably go for that a lot on many campuses. It's time to move ahead, and we're the future leaders of this country, and we're willing, to move ahead when we are able to, if the Iranians are. The Canadians, have reestablished relations with Iran. Maybe we could leverage some of that goodwill, not necessarily the Canadian government, but maybe with friendly Canadian Iranian organizations as well, and drawing in Americans, saying it's just time to move ahead, and perhaps have some ideas of where we could cooperate economically or scientifically, and then hope that younger voices in Iran would rise up as well. And so,
hope to that day. Dr. Daugherty, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for being here, sir.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.